Hello, let me see if I'm so sorry, guys. I really lost track of time. Thank you to everyone who is tuning in on YouTube and Rockfin. Let me pull up Rockfin as well. Um, so I was going to have my guest on about a week or two ago, and unfortunately, medical issues happened, and I was so thankful he wanted to reschedule. So thanks so much for joining me tonight, Keith McHemry, the co-founder of Food Not Bombs, which any of us who have protested knows. Food Not Bombs, they're an incredible organization. So thank you so much for joining tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's beautiful. So cool.
Absolutely. I mean, to start off, what was the conceptually what was the idea for Food Not Bombs?
Well, in those days, it was, Ronald Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter for president of the United States. And it looked like if Reagan won, that the U.S. economy and potentially the world economy would be diverted basically from what minimal social services we had under Carter and under administrations before that to basically be diverted to military spending. So that was one of the issues. But how it came about was I was a produce worker at a natural food store, which has been since been bought by Whole Foods. And at that store, I would get, I had a lot of, I would take up produce off the shelving and that was wilted. And I started taking it to these housing projects about 2 or 3 blocks away. I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This was in Central Square. I was studying painting and sculpture at Boston University at the time. I was I turned 22 about 2 weeks after I helped found Food Not Bombs. And anyway, while I was taking all this food to these families at these public housing projects. And one day they told me, "Oh wow, this new building across the street is a weapons lab at Draper Lab, and they're designing nuclear weapons." So initially we were calling ourselves the Food for Free Committee, and then I had in my last 2 books ago, Hungry for Peace, I have a photo of one of the original flyers, and it shows like the big headline: "Food Not Bombs, we never sell out, Food for Free Committee." But that we just at the end of that, the eight of us that were kind of moving around from collective house to collective house in Boston and Cambridge area, we decided, well, that would be a better name, because then when we arrive at a place to pick up food, we say, "Oh, Food Not Bombs is here." And so our idea was we wanted to get the American public to think, or the Boston area public, to start organizing and resisting a military buildup, and instead encourage that money, the savings from that, and there's going to be a peace dividend that turns out eventually supposed to happen but doesn't. So that was our philosophy of how we came about what we're trying, our message, and that's still our message. I'd say today that message should be more resonating than at any other time. But the other thing that happened was what brought the 8 of us together as Food Not Bombs was we were protesting at Seabrook Nuclear Power Station and had been trying to shut that down with Clamshell Alliance and the Coalition for Direct Action at Seabrook. And on May 24th, Brian Feigenbaum, one of our members, ended up getting arrested on felony charges. And fortunately, we had a contact with a person that had some money, and he bailed Brian out. And then on the way back to Boston, we decided, well, we got to pay him back. Probably the best way we could do, since we were living very marginally already, was to hold bake sales. So they did not really work. We would do these bake sales, and they were very financially. Basically, we just spent a lot of time baking a lot of stuff and making no money. So then one day, we also had an old van, and we had a moving company called Smooth Move, and I moved this family. and they had a poster that said, "Wouldn't it be a beautiful day if the schools had all the money they needed, and the Air Force had to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber?" And that gave us the idea to go to the Central Square Army Navy surplus store, buy some military uniforms, go to Brattle Square or to the Boston Commons and so on with our baked goods, with our sign, which is also in the Hungry for Peace, and urge people to help us buy a bomber. And at that time, it really kind of, we didn't make a lot more money, but it really stopped people in their tracks because it was, I had bright red beard and the same length hair, but red. And, and the, and that there in the media, there was a lot of this kind of poking fun at the fact that a bolt for a bomber would cost like $1,500, but the same bolt you could get for what, 5 cents at the hardware store, right? So we had our bolt there. We said we'd finally raised enough money for a bolt, help us get now another bolt, whatever. And so that got us this idea of doing street theater. And then we were also at that point connected to this group called the Living Theater, which is a radical street performance group. And they were experimenting with the idea of creating these events in the streets where it became unclear who the actors were and who the audience was. And so that we were very influenced by that. And so the success of this, like kind of every few days going out with this bake sale and delivering produce and other food from the bread and circus, started to unite as Food Not Bombs. And we came up with that, like I say, the name pretty shortly after this May 24th action. And so then we were like, well, let's focus all of our energy to shut Seabrook down and build a connection between Seabrook Nuclear Power Station and the nuclear weapons industry. And so we did enough research that we realized that the Bank of Boston was the kind of the center of financing the nuclear industry, and that they're going to have a stockholders meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank and near South Station, across from South Station. And that the board of directors, we discovered, and I've designed like this brochure showing how all the board members of the Bank of Boston were also on the board of Raytheon and General Dynamics and General Electric and all these weapons companies. And so we thought, well, let's dress up like hobos. We'll set up a soup line in front of the stockholders meeting. This is about 30 days after Reagan is inaugurated, March 26, 1981. And so we are, we're going to do this soup line. But, we had a lot of flaky activist friends. It didn't look like we were going to get but more than just the 8 of us participating, maybe not even all 8 of us. So I went to the Pine Street Inn, which was an old shelter from the Great Depression time. And I gave a speech at about midnight to the guys that were all sitting on these benches and on the floor. And they were so excited. Oh, protests like the 60s. This is great. And much to our surprise, they showed up the next day and it was a soup line. And some of the stockholders flipped us off. Other stockholders thought it was great we were doing this because the bank was terrible. And a number of business people came by and were like, wow, Reagan's only in office like a month and we've already got soup lines. And then our message with our flyers that day was, no, look, if we mobilize, maybe we can keep the economy from, the Chicago School of Neoliberal Structural Adjustment from impacting America. And maybe we won't have homeless people all over the streets. And so that was our message at that time. And that's how we became Food Not Bombs. Now the 8 of us were already very, I'd been an anarchist for years by that time. I took American history with Howard Zinn, who eventually becomes a friend of mine. So there becomes, we were like organizing against the war in El Salvador. We were supporting the uprising in Iran, which at that time was a left uprising before Khomeini took it over and killed many of the actual people that were in the core of overthrowing the Shah. And we were also the arms race was getting really heavy duty, and the U.S. used to have nuclear weapons on trucks driving all around Europe. And there was huge protests in Europe against the Pershing missile program. And so we would we organized actually a march on August 6th with the Cambridge City Council, who were our allies, and one of Carol Hill was one of the city councilors, was an old Black Panther activist, and so we had this very tight thing with local government, and so we did 3 marches against nuclear war that were basically Food Not Bombs and Cambridge City Council. That was the entire sponsorship of the marches, and so we did one in solidarity with the people in Europe. And I remember back in those days, you could call a information in Europe, like dialing 0. People that are not very old might not know that you could dial 0 and the operator would come on, and then you could get a phone number. Well, we kept calling operators in Europe and saying, hey, we just had a solidarity protest here in Cambridge. Can you tell the protesters in Germany that we're over here in America trying to connect with them? And we spent a whole day free calls to operators.
Wow, that's amazing.
Knew about it. So that's how we did our international organizing. And eventually we found a operator that knew people that were involved and claimed he would share the information with the German protesters.
That is so genius. Oh my gosh. So you said that you were about 22 when you started this, which is just incredible. So it's been like 4 decades, which is awesome. And how did you get radicalized so young? Were your parents activists at all?
No, it's kind of funny. So my parents were Republicans at that time. And my father was he was a park ranger, and worked in national. So I grew up in the national parks. I lived at Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Big Bend, Everglades, Shenandoah National Park, National Capital Parks, and then eventually, when I became a ranger, I worked at Fire Island and at Boston Historic Park. But the thing that, though, my life. So I was blessed by having this very, this family. So my mom's dad, my mother's father, my grandfather, Grampy Phelan is what we called him. He had been an OSS in World War II, stationed in Burma, and he would, he had organized and directed the firebombing of Tokyo, which is called Operation Meeting House. He was he had gone to Phillips Exeter and then to Dartmouth College and then Harvard Law. And he got pulled into like some kind of a secret society that was much more secret than Skull and Crossbones, but like a Harvard University version of that. And he became a part of the intelligence community. And he did 63, they did 63 raids on Tokyo. He felt he claimed he killed like 5 million people, but that's he may have only killed like 1 million. He also helped set up the heroin distribution to the United States to put down the Black community. And he was very upfront about all this, and he treated me like an adult. Even he explained that I would have to grow up to do this, and so on. He called it white man's burden. We'd have to determine who lived and who died, and the people we killed, they don't have any moral ambiguity. They were just dead. So, but then I would see him. The Vietnam War was raging, and my family go visit him. And at one point, I lived with him, and he would be arguing with his friends Curtis LeMay and Robert McNamara from arguing that they should drop the atomic bomb on Hanoi. So he was fair. He had a very clear understanding of why we should do this. He was clear that, he talked to me often about how we only use the symbols of democracy to keep our people repressed, because we don't dare allow the reins of control of our country to be given to like waifs and peasants, and so there's this elite group of people that run the world, and he was part of it, and I would be part of it when I grew up. So that's one end. Then my father's father was also a park ranger, and on his way to his first job at the Grand Canyon, he got in a traffic accident, or traffic. There was no traffic. He drove off the dirt road into off a cliff, relatively small cliff, fortunately, and some Hopi farmers found them, Hopi Native Americans in near this town called Old Arribi, which is the oldest continually inhabited community in North America, or at least in the U.S. I don't think North America, because Mexico City, for example, would be as old. But anyway, I was blessed when I lived at the Grand Canyon that he would come and camp out near us in the campground, and he taught me the Latin names of the trees and so on, and sagebrush and so on in the Grand Canyon. But he also the family would go out to see meet his friends, the elders, and we would view the like, for instance, the snake dance and the green corn dance and so on. And I also had the great fortune to go drive around and look at our family went and looked at all the ruins and Indian artifacts in what's now flooded, called Lake Powell. We watched the pouring of the concrete for Glen Canyon Dam and so on. So that had those two different things had a huge influence on me. And then probably the final thing, even though my father was not very political, he was a ranger, and he had a bunch of seasonal employees at Shenandoah National Park. And he gave me a copy of Walden by Henry David Thoreau. And I had just learned to read, and this was going to be my first adult book. So I read the back section in the Penguin edition of this, and that was on the duty to civil disobedience. And from that moment on, when I was in the 5th grade, I basically became an anarchist. Now, the other thing that was happening was segregation. So I lived in Luray, Virginia. Blacks lived on the west side of the tracks. The whites lived on the other side. Because I had dyslexia, I was in special education class with all the children that had Down syndrome, which is pretty common in that part of the world. And because of the insular communities in the Hollows. And then when the black people, they finally were forced by the federal government to desegregate, then the black kids came and they were deemed mentally ill and put in the special education so they wouldn't mix with the good white kids. And so I was just amazed by those kinds of things. I ended up, our family went on a vacation at one point where we stayed in Philadelphia the day after King was assassinated, and our family in Philadelphia happened to live in Germantown, and there was massive riots and military occupation, and I witnessed that. I witnessed all the troops entering into Washington, D.C. that morning, and I saw Baltimore burning from I-95 and so on. So it was these kinds of things in growing up that influenced my ideas. And I think the final thing where I became lifelong dedicated against corporate power and capitalism was I was on top of a mountain when I was like 16 in central Utah, and I could see all the black smoke coming down the valleys. And I happened to know that was emanating from Peabody Coal's power plants in the Navajo land in the Four Corners. And then around that time, I went down to Sedona for Thanksgiving with some friends of mine and saw the big power lines that are kind of famous in the Monkey Wrench Gang book and in real life when the informant cut down the high tension wires and the Earth First people were convicted of eco-terrorism and put in prison, even though it was the informant that did the crime. And so anyway, that I was just like, how could you desecrate? I mean, to be in the Hopi land before electricity arrived in the Hopi land, which I had done for several years, and to know those people had been there in this kind of cosmic, amazing thing, there just seemed so. It was just like, how could you do that? It was just like whatever economic system would allow humans to do something that egregious had to be stopped. And so that from then on, that's what I did. It was just work to.
Wow. So you actually wrote one of the most well-known books for leftists or whoever you want to say, the Anarchist Cookbook. Why don't you share what inspired you to write that and what that experience was like?
Cool. Okay, so this is a really fun. So my publisher. So I co-wrote with another person, C.T. Butler, the first book, "Food Not Bombs: How to Feed the Hungry and Build Community," and that got reprinted a bunch of times. And that was written on a computer program that no longer exists. And I was just basically, you know, just using the old plates to keep printing it and so on. And then at a certain point, it became I couldn't do, it was impossible to keep reproducing that book. It was so outdated and everything. I ended up writing a second book called Hungry for Peace. And my publisher is an anarchist publisher, Chaz Buffet, from now in Tucson at C Sharp Press. And so we were like, people would hassle me or Chaz about, they'd buy the Anarchist Cookbook by William Powell and find that it was just like kind of nonsense, and it was just about poisoning people and killing people and stuff like that. So we just decided, well, since we're anarchists, we should just rewrite the Anarchist Cookbook about anarchism, because William Powell put that together. He just went to the main library on 42nd Ave in Manhattan and just wrote down every bad thing he could write, and then he called it Anarchist Cookbook because his goal was to not be drafted into the Vietnam War. He was not an anarchist, really. In fact, the foreword to his book is written by somebody from the Revolutionary Communist Party. While we're friends, possibly in many ways, we're not. It's a completely different. That's Maoist. We're anarchist. And so anyway, I wrote Powell, who was emailed him. He was a principal of a private school in Kuala Lumpur at the time, and said, "Look, I'm going to rewrite the book, and I want to take your denunciation of your book as a preface to my book, and then I have Chris Hedges agreed to write the foreword to my book, and then me and Chaz, but mostly myself, wrote that book on the really about the principles of anarchism." And it actually took off. It's our idea was because being involved in this organizing stuff, I had a lot of friends that were duped by informants into doing crimes, or who were framed on crimes. And frequently the Anarchist Cookbook would be, they would circle the C4 directions in William Powell's version and use that in trials to convict Food Not Bombs activists. And then the final straw, actually, with these two women in Queens, New York, who were Muslim, friends who were Muslim, and they got arrested and charged with terrorism. And the only evidence was the fact that the FBI had given them a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook and had circled the C4. And their indictment was like 6 pages long, and of which it had a reprint of the page that was circled, the evidence or writing about the page that was circled. And I thought, man, if you could just, you can be, there didn't seem to be any reference at all in their indictment, in the complaint, that of them doing, or even proposing or thinking of doing terrorism. It was, and now we can see that virtually every domestic terrorist case in the United States that since 9/11 has basically been a concoction of the FBI, which is not, that was happening. That's been happening forever, but it became kind of more exciting after 9/11. So anyway, those were the things that we decided to do because we, being an anarchist, we'd like people to know about anarchism. And why have a book that's, really, I don't think that that was the Powell's book is the stereotypical capitalist version of anarchism. And the other thing that influenced, and I think is, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Warsaw Pact started to disintegrate, the young people over there were very interested in anarchism. In fact, they put out a actual hard copy magazine every month called "Abolish the Borders from Below," which were published by these assembled by and published, I guess you'd call, by these anarchists from Poland who were living in what had in East Berlin, and Food Not Bombs and anarchism just took off at that moment. And there was also a lot of disintegration of communist, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, and Trotskyist groups in the United States because of this. So that all kind of got wacky. And in fact, we were pretty low key about being anarchists up until that time, because you would, in fact, I don't know if this is exactly the main reason why this never happened, but I've only spoken at one national rally. I've been to hundreds of national rallies. I've fed people at hundreds of national rallies. In fact, Food Not Bombs spent the first 2 years focused on getting people out to the protest against the nuclear arms race in New York City in June 12th, 1982, which drew at least 1 million people, and that was a blast. And we organized that, but I mean, when I was 20 at that time, I was like 24, so I didn't anticipate I would be invited to speak at a rally. But after a few decades, you think of occasionally I would be invited to speak at a rally, but not that that's a big deal. But I think it indicates that sort of this uncomfortableness by the traditional left in the United States that to have anarchists speaking on the stage, because then it undermines more hierarchical ways of organizing, and it might be somewhat of a threat. Because they can't, because I'm inadequate as a public speaker. I actually, when I was a park ranger, I used to give. I worked at Faneuil Hall, the Cradle of Liberty in Boston on the Freedom Trail, and I used to have to give a speech like 6-7 times a day on the history of famous speeches at Faneuil Hall. So I got lots of that behind my belt. So I think that the other great thing was that once the Berlin Wall came down and all anarchism started just thriving in what we now call Central Europe, what at that time was Eastern Europe, the internet started happening. And what could be more amazing to a decentralized, non-hierarchical social movement than to have access to the internet and to the web? So that transformed things. And the other amazing thing is, so in '88, I eventually kind of had a lot of trouble in Boston, so I had to move in part because of protesting the anti-homeless policies that were just starting to emerge, and with the use of the broken windows theory of criminology. So my protesting was a little too, we built a pretty strong movement against these anti-homeless campaigns that were happening in the Kenmore Square area, basically, in Boston, and largely in part driven by merchants who somehow thought they would make more profit from high-end boutiques and stuff, even though that's where Fenway Park is, and it's just a college neighborhood, and whatever their dreams were never happened in the end anyway. But so anyway, I moved to San Francisco, and I thought, wow, this is a liberal city. I'd spent a lot of time in San Francisco over my life. So I organized a meal at the entrance to Golden Gate Park with 3 or 4 other friends. And we did it every Monday because the soup kitchen only did Tuesday through Friday, and there were churches that did the weekends. And the entrance to Golden Gate Park at the end of, hey, what a fantastic place to do outreach to community. And that became very politically intense. And so, because there was also this effort to get rid of the homeless, they actually renamed the Haight to calling it Coal Valley, because real estate, people wouldn't buy property in the Haight-Ashbury, but they'd buy property in Coal Valley, even though it was really exactly the same place. So anyway, on August 15th, 1988, riot police came and arrested 9 of us for serving food without a permit. And I had actually, oddly enough, been applying for a permit because some hippie who turned out to be part of a setup, actually, he was the director of the local soup kitchen, and the police said, hey, we're going to shut you down if you don't help us shut Food Not Bombs down. And so also we have to, it's very fascinating because there isn't internet in 1988 really, or things like that. So we had, it wasn't clear who I was to the people in San Francisco, exactly, the cops, so to speak, and like clandestine intelligence of phones and stuff like that was more antiquated in those days than it is now. So anyway, I applied for a permit, and they never responded until like all these riot police came out and arrested the 9 of us, and that shocked people. And there was a photo in the San Francisco Chronicle of riot police guarding the food. And that infuriated people. So then it started having the Monday march every Monday to Golden Gate Park, carrying food and so on. And there, it turns out, about 2 years ago, I have a friend who's doing Freedom of Information Act requests. He came across a document showing that the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force had been at the August 22nd, or maybe 24th mass arrest, I guess. And they published a memo, or they sent a memo to the San Francisco field office claiming that we were a credible national security threat. At that time, there was only Long Beach Food Not Bombs, Boston Food Not Bombs, and San Francisco Food Not Bombs. But they also turned out they were already wiretapping my home phone, and I ended up with oddly with a memo discussing what they were hearing on my phone, and in a lawsuit that we filed, and that became discovery. So it's like 30 Food Not Bombs people, and we were a national security threat according to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. But that arrests in all through August and Labor Day, I think 54 people were arrested. It generated a lot of news. That was pretty much the last time we had a lot of mainstream news, really. But we were in the Times of London, and then the Times of India. We were in the New York Times. We were in the LA Times, so on. So people would then call. I had rented a answering service at Mailbox, etc. on Polk Street then. That poor guy freaked out and said, hey man, you're paying $5 a month for unlimited calls, but I've hired 3 people to just answer your phone calls. And then I sometimes I would get letters saying Food Not Bombs, San Francisco, California, USA, from places. And so I just people wanted to know what to do. So I took the notes from starting the second chapter, because I thought, well, here it is. We can start from, scratch and lay out a plan of how I just write down what it is I've been doing to start the second group. And I made a flyer called 7 Steps to Starting a Food Not Bombs, and then we would mail that to you. So by 1992, which is when the first World Gathering happened, which is also coincidentally when the first Food Not Bombs book came out, there were groups in Melbourne, Australia, Prague, Czechoslovakia at that time. It was not Czech Republic. In Brixton, 121, I forget the name of the street now, but the famous punk club in Brixton, and there was Victoria, British Columbia. So I think by that time Toronto might have just started, and there was a New York City group, and Portland had started up, a Seattle group had started. So there was a number of groups around the world, and it was at that gathering in San Francisco, which was also coincided with the 500th anniversary of Europeans invading the New World. And we participated with the American Indian Movement, with all these Native American organizations, in protesting that, because San Francisco, because of Pelosi's pull, actually, in Congress, they were able to get the national celebration to be on Columbus Avenue in San Francisco. And that's why First Nations people from all over the world came there to protest that. And we did our gathering in the days before that protest. And that's when we came up with our 3 principles: that the food is always vegan or vegetarian and free to anyone, rich or poor, drunk or sober; that there would be no headquarters, directors, leaders; that each chapter would be autonomous and would make decisions as a group using consensus, and would involve the people relying on the food to participate in the decision-making process. And the third was that we are not a charity, but that we're dedicated to taking nonviolent direct action to change society so no one has to live in the streets or eat at a soup kitchen. And those 3 principles got reaffirmed at the next World Gathering in 1995 during the 50th anniversary celebration of the founding of the United Nations at Plaza. And oddly enough, we were now serving twice a day in San Francisco. We were being driven out of Civic Center Plaza into Plaza by the daily arrests. And so it made a lot of sense that we would then call a gathering there. And that's where we started Indie Media. We had an Indie Media Convergence Center in an office we rented above a theater. We had a pirate radio station. We took over a series of buildings at the military base, Presidio, which was just then starting to be decommissioned. And we have all these workshops. And then we also, there was, I think, roughly 130 arrests for serving food with actually felony conspiracy to serve food in violation of a court order, which is what was happening by that time. And then we had the largest arson arrest in U.S. history, where we marched with torches through the streets against the death penalty and to defend Mumia Abu Jamal. And so it's a 10-day event. It was like unbelievably magical, and that really just kicked Food Not Bombs off globally. And definitely the punk community, which we were, very involved with, the liner notes and so on, in like Propagandi's band, or in, MDC or Avail actually started Richmond, Virginia Food Not Bombs. Bad Brains was like our house band for DC Food Not Bombs. So all the punk scene started to really adopt Food Not Bombs, and just as an example, a European punk band toured the Philippines, and every single stop they would buy a huge brass kettle and do their first Food Not Bombs meal with the local people in that town. And by the time they were done traveling the Philippines, Food Not Bombs was active in 50 cities. A similar thing happened with Indonesia. A punk band toured Indonesia, and when I arrived in Indonesia, there was over 100 chapters in the all the spread through all the islands. And so that it worked to our advantage to be arrested. Not that it was all that great. I ended up getting framed on assault, battery, strong arm robbery, when a mayor attacked me in a phone booth. A mayor's aide, his film commissioner, Nick Rommel. And then I was later, another politician slammed a door on me. Me and a friend of mine, Jesse, were handing out the copy of a fax we gotten from Amnesty International saying that they would declare us prisoners of conscience if we were convicted. And a woman, there was this woman, Barbara Kaufman, who's like the Rush Limbaugh of San Francisco. She slammed her door on my friend, and I put my hand out to stop it, and it cut my hand, and I got charged with trying to kill her with a glass. And then by this time, to do the meals every day, because the police took all of our stuff all the time, we were using milk crates as a table. So they accused me of stealing 24 Berkeley Farms Dairy milk crates. And we had all kinds of programs, like we had risk arrest one day a month with Food Not Bombs, and then church groups and other community groups, other political groups would help us cook and then come out and serve the food and go to jail. And then we also had to do decoy food all the time. So we'd have buckets with very tiny amounts of food in 5-gallon buckets. And then the police would usually make one wave of arrests and take our little cardboard sign. Then we'd come up with another one with another, like a sheet saying Food Not Bombs on it, and some more decoy food, and then they'd arrest them. And then usually at the end of that, we would be able to feed everybody that came. So that went on for like 8 years, and there's a total of 1,000 arrests of Food Not Bombs activists. I think I had 47 felony conspiracy to serve food cases happening when I pled out of my case, and I pled out because they were bringing riot police to each of my court appearances. You had to go through a separate metal detector to get into the courtroom. Plainclothes cops basically filled half the audience in each of my court appearances for that, and then I ended up getting captured 3 times during that, but after work, and taken to in a blackened vehicle to a garage where I would then be taken to this dark room. They'd rip my clothes off of me, lift me by my arms and legs until my ligaments and tendons would rip, and then they'd stuff me in a stress position cage for 3 days, and so that happened to me 3 times. So eventually, it was clear I would not be getting a fair trial, and I would be getting potentially life in prison. So I pled out for assault, battery, and strong arm robbery, and the district attorney agreed to the judge, Judge Lucy McCabe, that I did 500 days in jail, and so I got credit for time served, and I had this very limited probation that I myself got to write because I knew that they would violate me. I ended up spending all this time in San Quentin if I didn't do that, and they even tried to put me into San Quentin a couple of times. Fortunately, because of this agreement, that didn't happen. But so that all of that generated this huge amount of excitement. Same thing happened when they arrested the LA Food Not Bombs. Same thing in Acadia Food Not Bombs when they arrested the kids in Tampa. They've gone through 5, I think, waves of arrests in Tampa, Florida, Food Not Bombs. Also, Fort Lauderdale Food Not Bombs, Orlando Food Not Bombs. That generated a huge amount of news because of Commander X and a bunch of people in Anonymous did a whole cyber protest against that. That gave protests a whole new angle, so it wasn't just a bunch of people getting arrested for serving free food in Orlando story. That's how we ended up in the BBC and stuff like that for that. So every time, and right now they are ticketing Food Not Bombs in Houston every night for serving food there, and they've been serving food for 20 years outside the downtown library, and exactly the same thing that they were proposing in Orlando is happening in Houston, and they have like this like industrial area underneath a freeway near the police station where they said, oh, that's the only place you got to get these permits and stuff, and then you can serve inside of this industrial yard under this freeway. If you're trying to organize against war and against the policies of capitalism, it doesn't really help you to be underneath a freeway where no one will ever see you. In fact, in their negotiations, I talked to particularly Nick Cooper about this. They tried to negotiate, and one of their say, okay, we'll go there, but you have to put a huge billboard for that because it's this clover leaf, or it's like a spider web of highways that said, about Food Not Bombs, where we're serving, and the Houston Food Not Bombs website. And the mayor refused to do that. And, so that was that. And now they're, I think the local Houston people think in part it's the NAACP's or some football or basketball tournament or something that's going to happen in Houston, and they're trying to get rid of the homeless from downtown, and that's why it's taken them a few years before they started really harassing Food Not Bombs. I think they're kind of wise not to arrest people. It's a good strategy from the city government's point of view, but still, it's pretty outrageous that you'd even have to pay $1,000 ticket or whatever it's going to be, and you could end up being convicted and put in jail. But it's not as dramatic as it was sending 45 riot police out and arresting dozens of people, was the case in San Francisco.
Do you have a guesstimate of how many times you've been arrested?
Well, I was, what is it? So, yeah, it's getting close to 200 times, I would say.
That is so badass.
So there's a couple of times for just being a regular poor person, my first 2 arrests. so I was arrested in Portland, Oregon when I was working as the superintendent of the Portland Art Museum. I was like probably 18 at the time. And I was assaulted by some cops in front of my apartment in the rain and so on, and I ended up getting arrested from that. And then I had a shoplifting arrest where I was actually standing in line waiting to buy the food, but they'd seen me eat I ate like it was a Safeway. This was pretty common at Safeway, but they were being new hippie Safeway, and I'd worked at the food co-op and I'd worked, doing stuff like that. So I thought, oh, I'll see the maple and the plain. Why is it so much more for the maple? And then somebody saw me do that, and so while I'm waiting to buy my V8 juice and granola, I got arrested for that. But then I got arrested a lot for posting flyers and against the war in El Salvador and against the nuclear arms race, stuff like that in Boston. So there was a bunch of those arrests. I did a bunch of mushrooms one time with one of the other co-founders, Jesse Constable, on Veterans Day weekend, and that probably was 1980. And we were just so happy on our mushrooms, and we always had a lot of spray paint, did a lot of graffiti and a lot of wheat pasting and stuff. So we went to Draper Lab where the nuclear weapons were being designed, and we drew flowers all over it. And we got arrested for that and spent like 3 days in jail. That was a lot of fun. And we actually, the Funa Bombs kids were able to get the police to give us everyone in jail, which was probably 8 people in that little jail, slices of tofu pie, things like that. And then I started getting, then the San Francisco arrests. That was, I think it was like, it had to be, I think it was like 40. Well, I had 47 felony conspiracy arrests, and so I think I got up to about 90 some arrests just in San Francisco, and then the 2 arrests in Orlando, and then a bunch of arrests in Tucson. For example, on the 18th of it's the 20th anniversary of my arrest outside the federal building in Tucson, and that one I ended up getting convicted on. I haven't been able to figure out what the penalty was. It got appealed by a ACLU attorney, but I never found out I know I lost, but I don't know what the outcome was. I was getting a bill. So that was kind of a funny arrest. 4 Marines came marching down the street towards the federal buildings with bullhorns, and they were with a bullhorn. And the one Marine was like, stood on this fountain, which had a very narrow ledge on it, which was designed so you wouldn't stand on it and therefore fall into the fountain. And his bullhorn was so heavy that when I got up out of my chair to avoid being clonked on the head by his bullhorn, it kind of startled him, and he fell into the fountain, bullhorn first, and then I got arrested and convicted of assaulting a Marine. The funny thing about that is he ended up getting busted not long after that selling cocaine. He was a Marine recruiter, and he was selling cocaine at Ampi High School as part of his Marine recruiting program, and ended up in the brig. And I don't know how long that happened, but I never paid for his bullhorn, I can tell you that. And I never actually, so there was that. And then I got arrested doing, with a bunch of us, we started a thing called United Neighbors, and we did a weapons inspection just right when, all the weapons inspections were happening in Iraq. And we went to Raytheon Missile Systems, where they were actually make the cruise missiles. And we had gotten lab coats from a theater company and little hard hats and clipboards. And we went into Raytheon. We started marching into Raytheon to see if they had weapons of mass destruction. And we got arrested for that. And it was an awkward moment for Raytheon because, their stockholders thought they were making weapons of mass destruction. But it's kind of crazy that they would, because then we're looking for weapons of mass, like Scott Ritter and all of them are looking for weapons of mass destruction over in Iraq. And so there's so there's those kind of arrests. And I was recently, I pled out on another case because my co-defendant was freaking out and for doing a First Amendment activity on Pacific Avenue in Santa Cruz. I got arrested recently for trying to serve food in a parking garage in Santa Cruz. So yeah, that's a lot of arrests.
Wow. Oh my gosh. That's so badass. Oh my gosh. And it sounds like most of them were just such bullshit. Like hanging up flyers, getting arrested for that, like handing out food. Oh my God. And that shit still goes on. That's what's
yeah.
incredible.
Well, I'm like really upset. I have like all, one of my, an acquaintance of mine, Manny, who was shot to death at the Stop Cop City protest. He was hit by, I think, 12 to 13 bullets, and it turned out the cop that got shot was friendly fire. That's what it's looking like now, and that's like a more frightening than what one would expect type of. They try to downplay it as a little, training place for Georgia cops, but actually it looks like it's when you look at their publicity, the Cop City publicity. They're anticipating bringing people from all over the world to learn how to be really good cops, and they even have an urban warfare with, armored vehicles part of the idea and so on. So it's like a pretty frightening project that should definitely not be happening. And then those people are all, I think there's 23, maybe 28 people now currently charged with domestic terrorism.
Right.
And on top of it's quite stunning that can be happening. We imagine that it's becoming a totalitarian, like technocratic, crazy kind of country, but that's like going way over, going way out there, to be painting and not letting these kids out. They won't let them post bail. That's pretty extreme. And but we had the RNC 8, which were all Food Not Bombs kids in Minneapolis. They were all charged with terrorism at the RNC back in, I forget what president was running, or I think Obama was running against, and I forget who he was running against. But so there's that. So there's been Eric McDavid, who and Ren and Zachary, they were arrested on terrorism charges. That the informant Sarah, who actually I recently found her real name, but I forget what it is. I was hanging out with her and Zach and with Ren and Sarah and them at the World Gathering in Philadelphia in 2005, and it was just shocking. He got 19 years in prison for nothing. He fortunately was eventually was. They withheld. It was clear there was a law. In fact, one of my former attorneys for my 3 strikes case, Dennis Cunningham, were able to find documents showing that they had withheld a lot of evidence in Eric's case, and that there wasn't even an actual plot. It was just like the informant kept suggesting that they bomb this dam and bomb that bank and blah blah blah, and then Eric had no idea that was even a good idea at all. He just really was like thought she was like just being tough, didn't really pay attention to it, unfortunately. And that's what and one of the things I write in one of the reasons I wrote Hungry for Peace is I wanted to have a whole thing about that case and about other frame ups of Food Not Bombs kids. And I try to give this advice. If somebody's talking about violence and so on, you got to speak up real loud that you're not going to participate in that, because unless you are willing to do life in prison. So don't, this is very, I was in an organization before I did Food Not Bombs called Boston Alliance for Against Registration of the Draft. And at the beginning of every meeting, we'd all joke about getting guns for the revolution and stuff. Well, obviously all these young people came there because they didn't want to be drafted into the war. And so our numbers, which were really big at the beginning, dwindled down to about 10 people. So we decided to figure out why did everybody stop coming, and we had this overwhelming response that people didn't like the fact that we were always joking about getting guns for the revolution. So I proposed that me and my friend Frank proposed that we stop doing that for a while. We call everybody back up and say, hey, we apologize for that, but we still got to, the draft registration is about to be enacted soon. We want to go forward with our program. And as it turned out, everybody was in the either FBI or some other intelligence agency in the entire organization. Just me and Frank were the only two people that weren't spooks. And that destroyed that organization like 2 or 3 weeks before the big rally to stop registration in the draft. So, I had a lot of experience with that kind of stuff, with surveillance and everything. So.
Wow. Do you think that, like, I'm not saying one rally here, one rally there. Do you think we have an actual anti-war movement in our country?
Not now, unfortunately. Yeah. And since COVID happened, boy, the activist community has been really divided, and social media has certainly not helped that, and as we can see from like Matt Taibbi and the others, the amount of control of social media that the U.S. government directly does is pretty profound. So I think we got to rebuild an anti-war movement. So Code Pink, I've been good friends with Medea Benjamin and Jody and them for years and years. I actually helped plan the Unfree Trade Tour in Medea's office at 16th and Mission Street, and which was a 2-month tour that turned out I took an Interpol agent around North America for 2 months. But it was successful at encouraging people to organize against the WTO. And a year after our tour, it was announced our proposal was, if the WTO has a summit, the World Trade Organization has a summit in North America, we should all go there and blockade it and try to shut it down. It was announced 12 months after the tour that would be that it would be in Seattle, and so then we organized to shut down the WTO in November of '99. But Medea organized and Code Pink organized an anti-war protest against the calling for peace in Ukraine early on in this, I think maybe right before the Russia entered, and it was shocking. So probably half of the people at the protests here in Santa Cruz that I helped organize were from the Azov Battalion supporters, and they were calling for a no-fly zone or clear the skies, and were essentially neo-Nazis, right? So it's weird to have a peace rally where half of the people at the peace rally were pro-war and the other half were anti-war. And sadly, a lot of the anti-war people that weren't associated with this far right-wing group that came out to support us had no understanding of the origins of the conflict, and kind of felt for the main story, which is Ukraine was a happy little place, and all of a sudden Russia rushed across the border to seize it on its way for global domination. But which is complete nonsense. Now, Food Not Bombs itself, for instance, I've been very interested in Ukraine since Food Not Bombs provided meals for 100 days in Kiev during the Orange Revolution. And only to find out that was a State Department-run protest funded by the U.S. government and NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. And so that was like a soft coup. And right now, the U.S. is attempting to overthrow the country of Georgia right now. They probably will be able to get that coup go. Probably even during this broadcast, the coup may have happened. But
so to clarify, for 100 days, you guys gave people food in Ukraine to try and help, and then you found out it was a coup?
Yeah, it was a soft coup. Yeah, we supported the coup, unfortunately, and the Food Not Bombs kids were kind of mortified. It wasn't too long after it, the new person came to power that it was obvious it was a U.S. puppet, but and whose name I forget sadly. But anyway, so then after the next coup in 2014, I was watching news feeds about that and Twitter reports from the front lines and stuff. And then I saw, like, I was watching this video footage of the burning of the trade union hall in Odessa on May 3rd of 2014, and there was all these red and black flags. So it looked like most of the people that were rushing the building and burning it down were like these footballers. There'd been a big football match, and when they got out of the match, they all went to the trade union hall where there was a protest, like a tent city protest around the base of the trade union hall against defending the rights of Russian-speaking people in the Donbass region, and throughout the whole area, and well, for Odessa itself and so on, right? And the Civil War hadn't. That probably was the start of the Civil War. I would say that might be the day that you could say was the beginning of the so-called Civil War. And so I wrote my friends in Ukraine. I'm like, well, why are anarchists and these footballers burning down a trade union hall? And they go, oh no, those aren't anarchists. The black and red flag is the flag of Azov battalion, and it's the same white supremacist group that's hassles us all across the country, and at that time it was very, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, and the Nazi thing was real big all the time. I've gone with Food Not Bombs kids running through alleys, escaping Nazis. Nazis killed one of our volunteers, Timur, in St. Petersburg in, I think, 2004. And they also let off a time bomb at where we were serving food there. And they killed 3 other people in Russia. So it's not limited. So, it's like it wasn't like there's this hard border between Russia and Eastern Europe like there kind of is now. It was, Nazis were moving from place to place as anarchists were, So yeah, it was kind of shocking that happened, and then by the time you get to the invasion by Russia, the U.S. had, also I've been to these I lived in Istanbul for like 6 to 8 months before Bush was coming there to speak to NATO. And I would participate. I did a Food Not NATO protest with Istanbul Food Not Bombs outside the McDonald's in Taskin Square. And, then I protested I joined environmentalists, labor union activists, communist socialists, and so on, in huge protests in Bonn, Germany, against the EU and the Euro. I've been to other anti-NATO protests in Europe. So that's not like all of a sudden because of this war in Ukraine, suddenly, so people go, oh, well, maybe NATO's not so good. Look at NATO in Iraq, NATO in Afghanistan, NATO in Syria, NATO in Libya. I mean, it's not worked out for any of the countries NATO and the U.S. have invaded, and I don't know why people think somehow this particular situation is somehow different and will be somehow more virtuous. But a lot of the peace movement, I've been shocked at how many people go, oh yeah, we got to kill Putin, and that are Americans, that were leftists, that were anarchists. It's very, very bizarre, and anarchists and leftists have a huge number of them become pro big pharma. That's like the weirdest thing, and not seeing that there's a history from the beginning of our, we've been protesting capitalism and this kind of globalization of the economy for 40 years, now all of a sudden, globalization of the economy is great. A centralized corporate state is just what we want as left-wing anarchists. We want a war. Oh no, the war in Ukraine is good. Maybe the one in China is not. I mean, what is, this coup is a good coup. That coup's a bad coup. No, it is really frightening. But we need to. So from those early, it's been difficult. But we're organizing another one on here in Santa Cruz. I'm hoping this is happening in many more places. On the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which is Saturday, November 19th, and we need to step it up, and we would have a huge amount of impact if we did step it up. But there's this whole kind of using diversity and things like that, pitting people together. Everybody's a Nazi automatically if they are against that's the other weird thing. Where there's like right sector, C-14, Azov. There's a huge number of neo-Nazi and Stefan Bandera worshiping organizations that sometimes fight each other before the war internally on the streets of Ukraine, but are now united in this war. And at the same time, they've been bragging. I know the head of Azov was bragging about how wonderful it was. We were sending them all. I watched a video of him at their national conference before the Russian invasion, bragging about how wonderful it was. The U.S. was already giving them all these weapons, and they were able to sell them to Nazi groups throughout Europe and Asia. But then everybody that opposes any kind of thing that goes on by the U.S. government, if you're an American, you're automatically a Nazi. So everybody's a Nazi. If you oppose the mandates, if you oppose this war, if you are not real excited about all the train derailments or whatever the crazy, that nothing, the homeless population is getting larger and larger because we're sending, you're automatically a Nazi if you say, well, we don't think we should send weapons to Ukraine, which then get sold and shared with Nazis all over Europe. Instead of taking that money and spending it to end homelessness. So there's no ending homelessness program that HUD says for 20 billion they could end homelessness, which I think is way under low estimate, but easily the amount of money we've sent to Ukraine would be, in the Biden administration and stuff, we're paying their pensions, we're paying for their infrastructure, we're paying to digitize, make a utopian digital society in Ukraine. But we're not fixing our bridges. We're not housing our homeless people. We're not providing, addiction services. We never got universal health care. With this, I was, just suffering badly physical problems with from an old back injury. And it was like a nightmare. If my girlfriend wasn't a medical social worker, I would probably still be in bed someplace. It's outrageous. So that's what Food Not Bombs about. This is the time where Food Not Bombs should be rising to the top, but it is very complicated. So even in the Food Not Bombs world, for instance, we used to have these world Zoom meetings after the pandemic, and then we tried to come to an agreement that on a stance against the war in Ukraine, and we couldn't come to it because the people that grew up in countries that had been dominated by the Soviet Union, they supported NATO and they supported the war and they were against Putin. And I was advocating that we should have, our statement should be, end NATO, Putin out of Ukraine. No, we should just be only against Putin. And so that's been really crazy. And then the division in Food Not Bombs around, we have some Food Not Bombs groups do vaccine clinics. Other Food Not Bombs groups, half the people would never be vaccinated and didn't pay much attention to those details themselves because they were busy all day on the streets feeding people. That's here in Santa Cruz. We will be celebrating the 3rd year straight of every single day serving meals in Santa Cruz, where we were the food for homeless people. Unfortunately, we were the drinking water for homeless people for early on in the pandemic when they shut all the bathrooms down and so on. If you wanted water, you had to come to us. And so we've been out there every day for 3 years this March 14th.
Wow.
So that kept us
So
really
are you
busy.
guys funded by the people? Do you survive merely on donations?
Absolutely. Yep. It's all, and you can see really interesting things with that. So with a lot of our money basically is like people subscribing to our PayPal, and they're largely $5, $10, $20 donations. And then there's a number that are a real good-hearted people that have the resources that donate. There's a couple of people that donate $500 every month. Then there's a few, some hundreds. But when gas prices went up, there was cancellations like crazy. So the other thing where we rate, but the beautiful thing is that not, during the pandemic, we were spending $10,000 a month to do the Santa Cruz Food Not Bombs operation.
Wow.
And it was a struggle. And we did some benefit events, to try to raise money, but it was a struggle raising, because we had to rent a kitchen. There were so many logistical problems. We ended up buying Second Harvest donated money for us to buy our first refrigerated 20-foot shipping container, and then we fortunately, because we were the only visible thing outside other than cops and homeless people, right, we started getting enough donations that we bought our second shipping container, which we put at the lot where we were serving food. We had to move that a few times, but we were putting everything in our van, which took 3 trips, unloading and so on. It was like we were, the second shipping container we put all our equipment there. It totally transformed things, but we kept getting jacked up by the cops, by the not really the police, but by the city government. And then we bought like a third one, and we started stockpiling food like crazy for fear that there could be, the way the economy and world events are, you just don't know what's going to happen with the food, potential food shortages, things like that. So we're trying to be prepared. We were already trying to prepare in case of a earthquake. That's why we got the first shipping container, because, a lot of us lived here during the Loma Prieta, and so we know what it's like. And so we had David Rovics do a benefit concert for us to raise money to get the equipment and stuff to deal with a possible earthquake. Food Not Bombs in San Francisco, we were the only food for the first 3 days of after the earthquake, because we use propane stoves. Wow. We are flexible and so on. We didn't need to. We weren't in a building. We were outside. It's sort of interesting how the pandemic, we were outside, so we became the only food program because all the others were inside. Loma Prieta, similar thing. Northridge earthquake, similar thing. Tsunami, Christmas tsunami. Wow. Food Not Bombs was super active in that. The tsunamis that have been happening, cyclones and so on in the Philippines. Food Not Bombs is often the first, because we have groups in there, so many cities when the event happens, and we're very agile because we don't, So that's, and then I know a lot of. Occasionally, we will get requests from chapters to help fund programs in other places. For a long time, we were sending $500 a month to Kenya, to the Nairobi chapter, but that person came to the U.S. The people that were organizing that left Nairobi and came here, so that stopped. But so we've been.
How many chapters do you have?
We have at least 1,000, although in the last 3 or 4 days, I've learned of several more. I mean, there's a new local Hayward group that just started up. There's, so yeah, there's it's definitely 1,000 groups. It could be many, many more. It might be 2,000 groups. It's very hard to tell. We have like 3 or 4 groups in Tasmania, all the major cities of Australia. There's, new groups have just sprung up again in New Zealand. Like I said, there's at least 100 cities in the Philippines have Food Not Bombs chapters, 50 in in the Philippines. 100 in Indonesia, 50 in the Philippines. There's a couple in India. The South African Johannesburg chapter. There's just now a new Cape Town group. New Buenos Aires. Somebody just is starting one in Buenos Aires again. We used to have them in Buenos Aires, and we used to have a lot in Brazil. That I wouldn't be surprised if that starts to spring up again. We have Peru, Santiago.
Did you have any idea when you were 22 that this was going to evolve into 40 years later, 1,000 chapters?
No, I think it's so interesting when you're that age and America at that time. So I've just finished writing my memoir, and I'm trying to come up with a name for it. But right now it's called Soup Street, and it's fascinating. So there's no internet. There's there's the Soviet Union. You in 1980 you would never imagine that you would ever speak to anybody in the Soviet Union. That was sealed off from us forever. From our perspective, by that time, I did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I got under the desks in kindergarten, and at that time I lived in Bethesda, Maryland, and your whole world. Now there's in '89 when the wall comes down, that changes everything, and then when they invent the internet, or at least we have public access to the internet, that's a whole nother trip that's going on. It's incredible. So it would be very hard to imagine that many. I remember maybe during the first 8 years, which I just did it in Boston, and then took food to protest in New York and Washington D.C. or up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, things like that. But we were a Boston-centered group, and we were the only group. And so we would, sometimes we go, man, wouldn't it be cool if we had a group out in Amherst, Massachusetts? That would be amazing. So our worldview was New England.
Right.
And then I remember seeing the first Food Not Bombs flyer from a group in Germany, and the hand holding the carrot looked like Albert Dürer at a woodcut or something, and then to see the first Food Not Bombs, and then to say Food Not Bombs in German, you're like, wow, and things like that. Yeah, you would never be it's almost, it's this funny kind of out of body experience. It's almost like, how did this even happen? And I'm just as amazed about it as probably anybody. And it's a good thing we have this non-hierarchical, decentralized anarchist philosophy, because there's no way if you had a president someplace trying to get this to happen someplace, it would have never happened, right? It's the fact that we just have these basic principles that makes it possible, and then I never trademarked. I remember one time I was living in my van for years, and I was sleeping on the edge of Lake Champlain in Burlington, Vermont, and this guy calls me up. He's all excited about what's going on. He heard about us. He's he's arguing, you've got to get trademarked and all this stuff. He was like a marketing professional someplace, and I think he was in Madison, Wisconsin. And he was like, oh man, they could steal your stuff and blah, blah, blah. And I'm going, I want all my stuff stolen, And every once in a while there'll be a thing like, I know Bittman on I think that's his name, is had a piece in the New York Times every week on food, and their logo was the carrot and the fist, and people would send me pictures of that, like, what the hell, the New York Times stole your logo. Okay, I don't care. And then people it became such a cool thing. And then you go around to Asia, and the fist is holding rice in it, and then you go down in Mexico, they've got these beautiful logos where instead of it being a carrot, it's corn, or it's a pepper. It's just
that's so cool.
This whole homes not jails, and food not lawns, and pirate radio, and all these things, and this whole 40 years of just been this amazing mixture of trying to handle what people really need, but from an anarchist point of view, because people don't need war, and they don't need profits and all this stuff. They need food and clean water, and they need housing, and they need community, and they need education and culture and things like that. So that's in communications. So and Hungry for Peace particularly, but also the Anarchist Cookbook really shows how that's these are the infant steps of trying to create a world free of domination and coercion, and where they're focused on the stuff that humans really need, and not on all this nonsense that we get, the bread and circuses, so to speak, that and the
And I
distractions.
feel like we could talk for 100 hours, but I do, before we go, I want to definitely ask you, what is something you want to leave with our audience, whether it's to give them hope, or to convince them to be, at this point, create an anti-war movement. What do you want people to take away from this?
Well, I think right now the most important thing is to build an anti-war movement, and to do it fast, and to also and to unite with to not be like, so that person is like a churchgoer, or that person is libertarian, or that person is a communist, or what, like, for instance, like Answer Coalition, and I've worked with them for decades now. I'm not, I would never join them or something like that and be a member of Answer, but I support that protest just like I supported the Rage Against the War Machine protest, because I think it is so dire. So my experience from watching my grandfather argue with McNamara and LeMay to drop the atomic bomb on Hanoi, he came from the same places as Victoria Nuland and her husband, Robert Kagan, and them that are right. So I became alarmed when I start reading like foreign affairs articles and stuff advocating first strike against Russia and China at the same time. These people actually think this is a good idea. I'm more worried that the U.S. will launch the first nuke than I am about Russia, but it's certainly they're doing everything to try to get Russia to launch the first nuke so they can launch their nukes. I mean, these people are psychotic, and I don't think people realize how dangerous this is. This is not like a fantasy or something. I know how these people think, because I grew up with one of the architects of this kind of ideology. And so I think we need to get out on the street. But the other thing is that I think people are somewhat disheartened because, we had I think there's 20 million people on the streets one weekend against the war in Iraq worldwide. And I was participated in protests of at least 1 million people in San Francisco, both at Desert Storm, the first Gulf War, and the second. They had I wasn't at the ones in the second Gulf War, but they had huge protests then, and it didn't end up being enough to stop the war. So we're going to have even more creative things, because this is really life and death at this point. And the other thing is to build even stronger systems of mutual aid, because I think that and to do things like refuse to participate in the digital economy. Use cash and things like that. Realize that there's like a digital, there's like this attempt to put everyone into kind of this digital matrix, so that essentially, if you are successful at, say, if you were trying to stop Cop City, they could just delete everybody's bank accounts and stuff like that, make it impossible for you to travel. If they're holding like 25 or so people as domestic terrorists because they could be a flight risk, as they were saying, because they came from, like Mandy, he came from, Tallahassee, food not bombs, they'll just make it so you can't buy gas outside of Atlanta. So you never, you could never get there, things like that.
Yeah.
You can get blacklisted and just eliminated digitally. So I think fighting back against, like what some people call the Great Reset, I think that, but really the Ukraine war, then of course they need to get more people on board that might be not sympathetic to that, to focus on China. I think there's a real threat to having a war with both China and Russia. And I think part of it is to institute I've just been seeing like Bernie Sanders on his book tour. He keeps talking about a one world government, basically. I mean, that was and he supports the war in Ukraine and so on. It's just like heartbreaking, that all those young people that were so excited about Bernie just were, all that energy was just sucked into this abyss. And I think that plays a big role in why we don't have a big anti-war movement. Both the failure for the people that remember the beginning of the Gulf War and all that organizing, and its failure to stop it, and 1 million people killed anyway afterwards. It's disheartening. And then the idea, and then all the propaganda that gets people, really well-meaning people that I thought would be 100% understand that the U.S. has really been moving towards the Russian border, moving NATO towards the Russian border, and using, this is a proxy war. I mean, they tell you, right? The government people tell you that that's what they're doing, right? It's not like a secret that they're not a proxy war. They're bragging that they want to kill Putin. I'm not seeing U.S. media saying that Putin is wanting to kill Biden, or even Zelensky. They're not. Right. The U.S. media, who should be, if there was ever a hint of Putin saying that would be all we'd see in the U.S. media, right? But we're like, our politicians, like, oh yeah, we got to kill Putin, That's unbelievable. So we've got to get out. We got to build community. We need realize that we're going to have to depend on ourselves. I think that the government is essentially kind of imploding into its own little corrupt way of gathering power and money, and of course has no interest in the people of the United States or anywhere, just their own megalomaniac control. So yeah, I think that we really need to make a huge movement, and I really encourage, and people can go to foodnotbombs.net and start yet another Food Not Bombs, we have to step this up, and this has got to be the most dangerous time. I think even like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists were saying, it's 90 seconds to midnight, and in my year, I'm 65 years on Earth, this has got to be the craziest, most dangerous possible time ever, and we got to unite and get out on the streets and to do other things, maybe occupy congressional offices. Whoever's going to all these like people's like Applebaum's speech, or all these people disrupting congressional speeches and town hall meetings, the people that are in the Bronx and stuff, going out after the Democratic candidates over there for supporting nuclear war. That stuff is powerful, and we got to do a lot more of that. We have to figure out ways to make it so disruptive that they can't possibly pull off this nuclear war, and we can't be afraid to be called Putin sympathizers and all that stuff. This is life and death for everyone on Earth, and it has to be thought of as that. And I don't think like aliens are going to interfere and stop the nuclear war. I don't think that somehow there's this magical thing that's going to stop the nuclear war. It's we have to be really, really organized, and we have to give up this. Most Americans, they might have voted for Trump or might have voted for Biden or whatever. That doesn't make any difference anymore. We have to be beyond that. We have to be united. And that's one thing I learned about in the pandemic. The people that I worked with on like when the Food Not Bombs van went down, and I go to Ron's to get it fixed, there's like his business is being hurt by the lockdowns and so on. These are salt of the earth people. They're the people that that Hillary Clinton called a basket of deplorables. And that basket of deplorables is really all of working class America. Yep. And if you're a leftist, you're supposed to be in solidarity with working class America. That's my tradition that I grew up in. And I'm shocked that now we're supposed to scorn the workers because they have wrong think. And I think that's outrageous. We have to get over that. If we're going to, it's crazy. We need to get out on the streets and protest, and we need to give up these differences between us that are really being cultivated by the divide and conquer policies of the ruling elite. That's why they use racism. That's why they use homophobia. That's why they use, sexism, as we're speaking here on International Women's Day. I mean, those, to make divisions as much as possible. So we're fighting each other over like these social issues, which are not, important. I grew, like I said earlier in the program, I lived in segregated Virginia. But this is being used as divide and conquer now. No longer, now the wokeness is being used as a weapon against us. It's hard. We've got to get over that. We got to go. It's the 1%, the oligarchs of this world against the rest of us, and the rest of us there are more of us than them, and we need to rise up and create like a decentralized, healthy communities that take care of one another and interact peacefully with the other self-sufficient communities near us, or more self-sufficient communities. That's what we've got to do.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is the most important time in my life to be organizing and resisting.
Absolutely. I cannot thank you enough, Keith. I want to first recommend the Anarchist Cookbook. Please read that, and your other book. And also, Keith, if you joined afterwards, he is writing a memoir, which is going to be fascinating, I'm sure. I cannot wait to read that. Please donate to Food Not Bombs if you can. And at the very least, please follow them on social media. Keith, anytime you guys need help raising money, I will gladly do a fundraiser on my show. Anytime you want to promote an event, just hit me up. I am here for sure.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joy. It's been fun talking with you.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you guys so much for watching. Tomorrow night, I'll be joined by Ron Placone to talk about net neutrality. And basically how fucked we are with this, with the lack of net neutrality, essentially. But Thank you again, Keith. Much love. Thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you. Bless you. Bye-bye, everyone out there in podcast land. Bye-bye.